you sign in, we'll get started. I think we'll introduce the people that we have here today. This is part of the Ethical Dilemma series sponsored by the Chinook Wind region and the McDougall United Church. This started as a project to bring more social justice issues within the church and to have time to learn about and to speak about and to have space for some of the issues that are most prevalent. And so we took some, what I've done is I've been doing this for now 3 years and looking at some of the social justice issues that we have before us in the current context. So at the very beginning, we did things like biotechnology and things like other issues along with some of the impacts of some of that. But what we started to find was that people were really interested in some of the social justice issues that we were doing within the United Church. So last year, I think we had about 60 or 70 people to the, well, not that, maybe probably about 50 or so to the environmental session that we had. And then, so that continued on. We continued to develop that proposal into what we were doing this time around, which is working on the Missing and Murdered Women Day, working on the work for the Environmental Earth Day and some of the issues around environmentalism for the United Church and for others, and with our community partners, the Calgary Climate Hub and other smaller organizations that are involved with climate justice. And so as we continue on in this vein, the second half of the series, today we're looking at race and the effects of racism within what's going on right now for the outbreak of COVID-19, and also what's going on for race as a larger issue, especially for the United Church, where the United Church has, in its last presentation for the General Council meeting, had a 2-hour people of color coming up to the mic and speaking about racism, speaking about the importance of recognizing and understanding and beginning to deal with racism within the church, but racism within the society as well. In general, I think as a whole, there are a lot of issues that we need to combat. And so the church, being one who brings this community voice together, is very important that we begin to take part in that dialogue. And so I'm hoping that this will carry forward in the type of work that we are doing here in this region. I think one of the things that I'll leave you with after this is to think about regathering in another way and to delve a little more into this topic, because I think that we'll get a lot of ground information here, but we need to do something with it. And I think that given the context and the opportunity that we have with the current situation, with our ability to have technology and people from across the country here that are interested in the topic that we have, that are needed voices in that, especially with the settler population and the settler church, becomes very important for our groups to participate and to be heard on a number of different levels. And so one of the things that we've done is to partner with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center to bring this presentation on race that they've done numerous times in different settings. And so there's usually a full day of presentation. So we've gone through the presentation last Friday for 4 hours and hopefully worked out some of the kinks of that. So we're not going to be sitting here for 4 hours, but we will bring the highlights. And I think that I have a number of materials that I'll be able to send out to people post gathering, but I can also send them out to you now if you send me your email address. Here we had a few more people sign in, so just put in your information in the chat. If you have to go at any point, we'll feel free to leave at any point, and the information can be sent to you from this session as a link, and that you can follow up there, or you can pass it on to others who can also take part in that, and they can email me back, Pamela and her group have been very generous in saying that they want to continue this discussion as well. So they are available to be contacted, and I think that that's a great resource for the church and for the work that we are doing. I just want to acknowledge that we have Richard Bott, who is our moderator for the United Church here. Thank you for coming and being part of that. We'll maybe ask you to say an opening prayer for us, if you could. Yes.
I would be happy to do that. Thanks very much, Tony. So shall we take a moment to gather ourselves together? Creator God, we come to this place from so many places. We gather from our homes, from places of work, from places of play, to be together in this virtual space. But what is real is the connection. What is real is the relationship with one another and with you. We pray for open ears and open hearts tonight, that we might truly be able to listen and to learn and to share at a level that makes change in this world, here and now, and in the days to come. We ask your blessing on what is going to happen here tonight. And we ask that you would help us to go into the world, to be people who are different, and to make a difference in this world. I ask these things in the name of my teacher and my friend, Jesus, who I call Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And I will pass this over to Pamela to give a short introduction. I just wanted to add that here in Alberta, we have a number of issues currently on the table for the LGBTQ community and for us, the Nakota people, with a lot of the issues from our COVID experience. And I think that it's important to acknowledge the nations here and the nations across the country that are hurting from the current epidemic and have been traumatized, I think, in numerous ways historically, and the intergenerational effects of that to the people today and how they react. I just want to acknowledge that they have a relationship with the lands here, an embodiment of those lands. And so I feel that connection to the world around us and the repercussions of our actions and our inability to get along with not only each other, but with the world around us. And so it's important that we at this time acknowledge and verify that we are on Indigenous lands and that we are here to share those lands. We are here to share that experience. And for us, this place that I am in right now is called Wichispa Oyade, which is Calgary in honor of the Elbow River. Also called Mukinsis in the Blackfoot language, and also called Wutsitsi, which is the traditional Tsuut'ina word for, and Tsuut'ina are Dene Beaver people. And so those are the three nations who signed the treaty here. That's the place that we are at. And we just welcome you all to this territory in this discussion. So next to Pamela.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues. And Tony, I wonder if you could put up the first slide, the blue one.
Okay. Give me 1 second. There we go.
Thank you. And so I'd like to introduce our presentation, Anti-Racism in the Times of COVID-19. And we are Heather. And Heather, give a wave. So Heather is a lawyer, and she's been a member of the Alberta Bar for over 30 years. And she's worked as a research associate and a human rights educator with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre for the past 3 years. Gosh, Heather, it seems like longer.
I know. It's gone by fast, though.
Yes. And I am Pamela. I have been a human rights educator with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre for just about 20 years. I do presentations at schools and community groups, and I create educational resources for the centre. My most recent work is, well, I should say my most recent works are a video on human rights discrimination and harassment, and one on seniors and discrimination. And we have Martha. Where's Martha? Martha, can you give a wave? Have we lost Martha?
No, she's there.
Okay. So Martha is a human rights educator also, and she has worked with UNICEF in Iraq for 2.5 years and with Save the Children in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. And her focus was on children's rights and human rights challenges in disrupted communities. Martha works across Canada with Indigenous communities, with rural and urban groups in peace and conflict transformation. So the presentation today is going to be in 2 parts. Heather is going to look at civil liberties, human rights law, and then Martha and I will look at anti-racism and what we all need to learn about anti-racism. So Heather, it's over to you.
Okay. Tony, do I have control or do you?
I do.
Okay. So could we
Just
go
let
to
me
the
know.
next,
Yep,
yeah,
next screen.
slide,
Okay.
please? Yeah. So that's good. Next one, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go. Okay, so thank you, Pamela, and good evening, everyone. I just wanted to start by saying that our topic tonight, anti-racism in the time of COVID-19, is very timely, given the discrimination, racial discrimination, and other discrimination that has arisen because of this pandemic. In particular, we've seen a rise, particularly against individuals of East Asian origin, but also against people of color all over the country and all over the world. These groups have been the target of discrimination, verbal attacks, including racist taunts, physical attacks in both physical and online spaces, and exclusion from services and facilities that are normally open to the public. So this we're going to talk about a little bit this evening. I'm just going to briefly talk about some human rights and civil liberties issues that arise from this, some other key issues, some of which are human rights related and some not. Then we'll look into the laws that make this type of behavior illegal, where those laws originated from was the United Nations, and then our Canadian laws, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Alberta Human Rights Act, and the Canadian Human Rights Act. We're also going to look a little bit at hate crimes and hate expression, and some seeming conflict sometimes with freedom of speech. And at the end, I may not get to this because I'm trying to keep myself within a fairly short time period, but we have a handout of all our resources, and so we've got them divided up in between sort of legal, with a legal focus, and those that Pamela and Martha are dealing with. So next slide, please. So in terms of the human rights and civil liberties issues and hate crime issues that come up, I've mentioned just now a few of them. So the human rights legislation across Canada prohibits discrimination on a number of different grounds, 15 under Alberta Human Rights Act. It's prohibited, and it's prohibited in 5 areas. The ones that are really the focus in this pandemic, I believe, are discrimination in provision of goods and services. So that might be health care, that might be education, things like that. Employment, which is self-explanatory, and tenancy. The other thing that's arising are acts of hate or speech, and those acts, some of those are crimes under the Criminal Code of Canada, and hate speech is also addressed under the Canadian human rights legislation. Next slide, please. So these are some of the other issues that arise outside of the main issues that we're going to talk about today, but just something to consider. And in the resources that I've provided, there's a couple of resources by Mr. Sujit Chandri, and it's part 1, COVID-19, and the Canadian Constitution, and then he's got a part 2 on that. So these issues are described in much greater, this isn't described in length at all, but in greater length in these articles. And if you are interested, I would recommend that that you get them. The links to the articles are provided in the resources. So one of the issues that comes up is the emergency powers legislation. Does it unjustifiably infringe on our fundamental rights under the Charter, our rights to mobility, our freedom of expression, all of those things, which I'll touch on a little bit later when we're dealing with the Charter. There's a lot of lockdown legislation would be another thing there. We're being prohibited from moving and doing certain things that are our constitutional right to do in normal circumstances. There's a raft of legislation, guidelines, and other policies that are coming out from the government as well. And one of the issues is, given the depth and breadth of these laws, the speed at which they're coming out, and the difficulty in locating them, how do we monitor them to ensure that they're not contravening our human rights laws and other laws that are on the books? That's a big issue. We know that there's been a rise in domestic violence. Alberta has a very high domestic violence rate compared to the rest of Canada, or higher than most of the rest of Canada. And a question arises, does the government have a positive duty to protect human life when it knows that this is going on? We've heard a lot of talk about contract tracing with cell phone data. Obviously, this raises issues of privacy. Resource allocation decisions by hospitals. We know that we know, like places like New York City, I don't know that it's happened it's happened perhaps in some of our nursing homes and so on in Canada, when the people who are healthcare workers that are looking after us are running out of resources. How do we allocate those resources between people? And this does raise issues of discrimination based on age and disability. And then another large one is the division of powers between the federal and provincial government. Right now, most of the legislation that's been passed has been local. It's been emergency measures acts passed by each of the provinces and territories, and by our cities as well, our municipalities. But this pandemic is interprovincial and international. So really, who has the jurisdiction to pass these laws and take charge of this situation? So just some things to think about. And if you're interested in those issues, again, I'd recommend the 2 resources that I mentioned. I was going to go to the next page, Tony, but could you please? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the human rights and civil liberties laws that affect us. And the first 2 documents we're going to talk about are from the United Nations. So if we could get the next slide, please. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a foundational document that came into force in October 1945, and Canada was one of its founding members. Actually, one of our Canadian heroes, I would say, John Humphreys, was a drafter of this legislation. I don't know if many of you may know that. And he worked with the United States quite closely in drafting this. It brought human rights into the realm of international law, this declaration. Canada was one of the original signatories, as I said, and it establishes an international standard of non-discrimination based on a number of grounds, including race, language, place of origin, that type of thing, all of which come into the type of discrimination that's happening right now. It's not legally binding in Canada, but the rights and aspirations that are in this declaration have been codified in a lot of Canadian pieces of Canadian legislation, quite clearly in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but in some of our other legislation, such as our immigration law and our corrections legislation and things like that. So it's actually some of these principles and rights have actually been codified in law in Canada. And even though it is not does not have the force of law, the Supreme Court of Canada has stated that the values and principles enshrined in international law constitute a part of the legal context in which Canadian legislation is interpreted and applied. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are 30 rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I just wanted to give this little snapshot. This is a very simplified version. They're much more weighty and lengthy than this, but you can see some of the things that are in here, including the right to be free from discrimination, right to privacy, freedom of expression, all of the kinds of things that many of which are enshrined in our charter and in our constitution. Next slide. So the other important piece of legislation from the United Nations and internationally that deals with racial discrimination is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It came into the UN in I can't see the slide here, 1970, I believe it was.
65.
Oh, thank you. And Canada ratified it in 1970. I don't know, maybe I can move our pictures over just a titch here. Yeah, that helps. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so, by ratifying this convention, Canada accepts responsibility for respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the rights that are underneath this convention. And it also requires Canada to submit a report every 5 years to the United Nations, reporting on how it is implementing the obligations that it has under this legislation. And in 2017, the UN reviewed how Canada was doing in this respect, and it gave Canada good marks for some things, but it also mentioned a lot of things that we are not doing. And I don't think I've listed them there, but some of them have to do with it's requiring Canada to have a national action plan against racism, preventing hate crimes. I mean, this is still happening a lot in Canada, and it said you need to do more to prevent this. To implement the recommendations under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and under the United National Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. To have an anti-racism legal framework. It's a bit scattered right now, our legislation that deals with racism. To stop racial profiling and the disproportionate representation of African Americans and Indigenous peoples at all levels of the justice system. We know this is a huge issue. To ensure the full inclusion of Indigenous people in decisions that are being made and legislation that's being passed that deal with the Indigenous land rights. To stop violence against Indigenous women and children, discrimination against Indigenous children, discrimination in the educational system, and discrimination in employment. So those were all things that the UN found that Canada had was not taking appropriate steps to implement these things that they're required to do under this legislation. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about Canadian human rights and civil liberties laws, and we won't be going into it in any depth. We're just trying to set a legal framework here to start off by saying this type of discrimination that we are experiencing, that we're seeing, is illegal, and here's the laws under which it's illegal. So we'll talk about a few of those. Next slide. So the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Next slide, please. So just a few points about the charter. It came into our constitution in 1982, which was also the year that the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre that we work at came into being, which is rather nice for us. It's part of the Constitution of Canada. Therefore, it's considered the supreme law of Canada. If the government passes legislation or acts in a way that contravenes the charter, that can be taken to court, and if it's found that it's contravention, that legislation or those actions have no force and effect. It only applies to the government, so that's important distinction that to be aware of. It doesn't apply person to person. It applies with respect to acts of the government to keep government power in check and making sure that it's not contravening our fundamental rights and freedoms under this legislation. Section 1 puts reasonable limits on those rights. Section 33, you've probably heard about the notwithstanding clause, so that allows governments to sidestep the charter for a certain period of time in certain circumstances. It's very rarely used. And then the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has 7 distinct categories. Fundamental rights and freedoms, so those are things like freedom of conscience, religion, belief, that type of thing. Democratic rights, so our right to vote, our right to run if we're a Canadian citizen as part of the government. Mobility rights, so that is one thing that's obviously being tranched on right now with our inability to move not only internationally but interprovincially in some cases. Legal rights, these are ones that you're probably more familiar with, like the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, the right against arbitrary detention, trial within a reasonable time, that kind of thing. One of the most important rights under the Charter with respect to discrimination, racial discrimination, or other types of discrimination is Charter Section 15. There are language rights, and there are minority language education rights. Next slide. So I just wanted to have this up on the screen, which is Section 15, Equality Rights under the Charter. Just going to move this over so I can read it. So it says, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law, without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race and a number of the other provisions that are protected in these areas where we know that historically people have suffered discrimination more than those who are not described with these characteristics. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the Charter. Just seeing if I've got anything else in my notes that I want to say. One of the other things about the Charter that's not there, but on the slide, but Section 27, it has to do with multicultural heritage, and it says, this Charter shall be interpreted in a manner consistent with the preservation and enhancement of multicultural heritage of Canadians. So it's again important in this area of racial discrimination, because people are being discriminated against because of their cultural heritage and the places that they come from, and the religions that they practice because of that. Okay, so the next piece of legislation, the Alberta Human Rights Act. So that is the human rights legislation that governs in Alberta. Now this legislation, thank you. So it recognizes the inherent dignity and worth of every person and provides it for equal rights and opportunities of every person. And this is so that all people can be included in our society and have an opportunity to provide or use the gifts that they have to better our society. Again, it's primacy legislation. It's supreme law, as I sort of referred to the Charter, in Alberta, just in Alberta. So if the Alberta government passes laws or conducts itself in a manner that contravenes this act, it is illegal. It is against the Human Rights Act. It is similar, the Alberta human rights legislation is very similar to the human rights legislation across Canada. So there's a Canadian Human Rights Act, and all provinces and territories have human rights legislation, and they're all very similar. There are some small differences between them, but they're mostly quite similar. So the act in this case, not surprisingly, governs the Alberta government, but also residents and businesses in Alberta. And it kind of an important thing legally, and maybe it doesn't matter too much, but something that's always on my mind is there's a limitation period. So if there's an act of discrimination that someone has experienced, they have 1 year to bring a claim, or else that claim is barred, and there's some exceptions. And then the next slide, please. It talks about the areas in which discrimination is prohibited. So there's 5 areas. Publications is one. Services I've got there, the longer phrase says goods, services, accommodation, and facilities customarily available to the public. Discrimination is prohibited in tenancy, in employment, and in membership in unions and occupational associations. Next slide. And there are 15 grounds upon which discrimination is prohibited, and here they are. And you'll notice here that on the top left-hand corner is race, religious belief, color. I'm just skipping through here, ancestry, place of origin. All of those things would come into play perhaps in racial discrimination that we're experiencing right now because of what's going on with the pandemic. Next slide, please. I just wanted to mention the Canadian Human Rights Act as well. We won't be going into it, but as I said before, it's very similar to the human rights legislation in the other provinces and territories. The one thing about this, which I'm sure all of you probably know, is that it applies only to federal endeavor. So the federal government is administrative bodies and actions that are taken by the federal government. So where the Constitution has given the federal government jurisdiction, so things like airlines, telecommunications, that kind of thing. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about what is discrimination. None of the legislation describes discrimination, and it's like many things, the legislation will come in, and as we change as a community, our understanding of what discrimination is changes, and so they don't define it. But what the courts have done is taken this definition from a Supreme Court of Canada case, and they describe it as any distinction, conduct, or action, whether intentional or not. That's very important, because when we're looking at discrimination, it's not about whether the person who's being accused of it intends it or not. It's about the effect that it has on the person who is experiencing it. And then it has to be based on one of the 15 grounds that were mentioned before, which includes race. And it has the effect of imposing burdens or withholding benefits that others that, let's say, are not of a certain, the race that's suffering discrimination, it's not being imposed on them. So that's the kind of the broad definition, and obviously there's lots of case law talking about what is and what is not, and I'll be talking about a few examples of what discrimination is in this realm. Race may only be one factor. So if we're talking about racial discrimination, it only may only be one factor. There may be other factors that are the basis of the discrimination, but if race is one of them, then that's all that's required to bring an action and get relief under the Alberta Human Rights Act. And as I said before, intention of the person who is accused of racial discrimination is not required. Next slide, please. So, and next slide, I think this one I've got it going, yes. Discrimination includes harassment. Harassment includes unwanted or uninvited conduct. It can be verbal, physical, or nonverbal. Intention is not required. And usually a power imbalance is involved, although not always. Next slide. And so examples of harassment in terms of physical contact, touching, or physical assault, which can also be a criminal offense. So we're hearing instances of this going on in the streets, people being pushed, people being hit, that kind of thing, because of their race, and being accused because of their race of somehow bringing this pandemic upon us. Verbal harassment, so we're all familiar with racial slurs and jokes, derogatory comments related to a person's race or ancestry, place of origin, and can also obviously be nonverbal. So just the way someone looks at you, discriminatory images being displayed, and of course we know that a lot of what's happening now is happening electronically. It's happening online. Next slide. So here's some examples of racial discrimination. just going to move this over just a teeny bit more. So for example, this is not surprising, quite evident, but if in the area of tenancy, so one of the 5 areas in which discrimination is prohibited, a landlord were to refuse to rent to an East Asian person because they stereotypically think that that person is a carrier of the COVID-19 virus. That would be a very explicit and straightforward example of discrimination. Discrimination in the provision of goods and services. So this is coming from a case here in Alberta where this individual was denied entry to a nightclub based on race because they were wearing a turban, and was explicitly told that they didn't want any more brown, quote, unquote, brown people in the club. Discrimination in employment can be it can be a little more subtle, and it can be subtle everywhere, but these are some examples of what might constitute discrimination in employment. So unlike other people, person is excluded from formal or informal networks. They're denied mentoring or developmental opportunities, and they have different management practices that are applied to them that are more excessive than others. So with this kind of, excuse me, with this kind of thing, the courts, you know, if you look at one of these things, it's hard to say that that's racial discrimination, but what the courts will do is they'll look at it in context. And there's usually a number of instances that go on, and they'll look at it to see if they can infer discrimination based on the context. And I just want to refer to you this resource, which actually comes from the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre as well. We have done an annotation of the Alberta Human Rights Act. It's on our website. And if you want to get a lot more information about each of the sections of the Act, please go there. And we've got cases and articles and things like that that explain each section of the Act. And it will be in your resources as well. There'll be something in there that refers you to this. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into hate expression and hate crimes and freedom of expression. So we need to draw a line between what is and what is not hate crimes. So next slide. So hate expression is covered both under the criminal code and under human rights legislation and the charter. Next slide. Under the Alberta Human Rights Act, Section 1 prohibits hate expression based on any of those 15 grounds, including race. Expression is very widely defined as a statement, publication, notice, sign, symbol, emblem, or other representation. Discrimination is an action. It's when some action is taken to against another person that's likely to expose them to hatred or contempt on any of those 15 grounds. And the courts have defined hatred as meaning an act of dislike, detestation, enmity, ill will, or malevolence, and contempt as a condition of being condemned or despised, dishonored, or disgraced. So those words quite clearly go against the whole purpose of our human rights legislation. But Section 3.2 of the Act does put in a balance of sorts that says that this does not say that this act takes away our freedom of expression and opinion. That's often, as I'm sure you know, a defense that's raised when this kind of hate speech and hate action is put forward, especially hate speech, that people have a right to freedom of expression, and therefore you can't take that away. And I think the next slide is an example of that. So you could just get to oh, sorry, maybe not yet. Okay, so now I'm differentiating hate crimes. So hate crime has to come under the criminal code. It's an offense under the criminal code. It specifically says that it's hate that's based on all of these various grounds of discrimination, including race. There's sort of 3 sections of the code that deal with hate crimes. One is advocating genocide. I'll talk about that a bit. Communications inciting hatred against an identifiable group, mischief against religious property, and crimes that are motivated by hate. So for example, if an assault occurs and it was motivated by hate on the basis of race, that would be a criminal offense. And under the sentencing provisions of the code, if an offense is hate motivated, that is taken into consideration as an aggravating circumstance in sentencing, and it requires that the court consider that the sentence be greater because of that. Next slide. So advocating genocide, I'm not going to go into this in any detail. Pamela, how am I doing? 5 minutes? Thank you. Okay. So you can see this is a very, very serious offense. It's defined as actions against an identifiable group, namely killing members of the group or deliberately inflicting on group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. So obviously we all know about the Holocaust, and that would be an example. Next slide. Public incitement of hate. So everyone who, by communicating statements in a public place, incites hatred against an identifiable group, where the incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace, is guilty of an offense. And next slide. Willful promotion of hatred, that's in 319(2). Everyone who, by communicating statements, and some of these things are defined, and I've got the slide at the end that will tell what they are, other than in a private conversation. So obviously if you're having a conversation with someone in your household, one-to-one, not in a public place, this is not covered by this section, that willfully promotes hate against an identifiable group. And then there are defenses to this, which are listed below. So if the statement is true, if it's something that's relevant to the public interest and the person really reasonably believes that's true, and then a good faith intent to point out and remove matters producing or tending to produce feelings of hatred. So basically in that case, someone's saying it because they're trying to point out that this is occurring. That is defense. Next slide. So this is the case I was referring to. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Keekstra case. This was a teacher in Alberta who was charged under Section 319, charged and found guilty of Section 3 of contravening Section 319, and he was distributing anti-Semitic statements to his students in school. He was teaching them that the Holocaust never happened, and if the students didn't reproduce his views, they were marked down. So the Supreme Court of Canada found that this was an infringement of Section 319, and that freedom of expression could be limited in this context under Section 1 of the Charter, which is the section that allows these rights to be infringed for a reasonable purpose, because in this case, it was required to restrict this willful promotion of hatred. Mm-hmm. I think, next slide. So these are just definitions in the code of what these terms that I've just been mentioning mean. So identifiable group is defined, and you can see that this talks about all those 15 areas, grounds of discrimination that we talked about before. Communicating is a very broad definition, so not only by telephone, but anything that's audible as well or visible. A public place is very widely defined, and statements are very widely defined. Next slide. And this is another code section that deals with hate. Mischief relating to religious property is a crime if it's motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on these various characteristics or categories. Next slide. And so this slide just talks about, and I just want to read this one thing, if I may, just about hate. It comes from a decision of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia in 2013. It says, acts of racial hatred are not necessarily hate crimes. Physically attacking a person because of his race or sexual orientation is an assault. The sentencing of that crime must express public abhorrence of the action and of our collective refusal to countenance it. A racially motivated attack might be called a hate crime, and the label seems to make a lot of linguistic sense. It is not a hate crime under Section 319 of the Criminal Code. Hate crimes in that sense involve the promotion of hatred, not the expression or manifestation of it. These acts of racial hatred that are not hate crimes under Section 319 are dealt with by sentencing provisions in Section 718. So I'm just, this last slide just talks about what we can do, and Pamela and Martha are going to talk about that in much more detail, and that is the meat of this presentation is their subject matter that they're dealing with. But basically what this is saying is that, you know, we've got this legislation, but we're still experiencing this conduct in society. It isn't stopping it. There's NGOs that monitor this, and there's organizations that keep track of it. But as members of the public, as individuals, we need to stand up against it. We need to know when it's happening, and we need to do something about it, because that's what makes things change, is if people stand up and do something. Next slide, I think, are just my resources. Yeah, so those are all be in the handout. So
I think one of the questions that I had, just hearing that, is just the issue that came up this week or today with the sort of the incel, or that the line between hate and terrorism, and what is the sort of the boundary of these acts that are done towards specific groups for specific reasons, and then what marks it as a terrorist act?
There are other provisions in the code, of which I haven't got the provisions set up here on my slide, and I do not actually, I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I will get back to you with an answer. I don't want to say something that's not, it's incorrect, but it's a very good question. Thank you.
I think it's interesting just in terms of that sort of relation of it. And when we start talking about terrorism, I was thinking a lot about that implied sort of implication of others into, or coaxing them into acting on particular things. So that stochastic terrorist idea of, it would be really nice if someone did this, and then turn around and kind of incite people into that.
Yeah, incite people into that, and strike fear into the people of the, you know, that are being terrorized for a purpose of you know, of terrorizing them, of putting them in a position where they lose their power, their safety, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a very, very good question, and I'll get you an answer.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll turn it over to Pamela and Martha now.
Thank you. So Martha and I are going to be looking at specifically at anti-racism in these times of COVID-19. And so I just want to do an introduction to our topic. So in addition to the human rights presentations that we do, the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre, we do anti-racism work. We have a whole project or program relating to anti-racism and understanding racism. And that focuses on self-awareness and understanding what racism, including systemic racism, looks like. We use several experiential activities to help our participants understand what it is, what to look for, how to identify it generally, and also in ourselves, how nuanced and subtle it can be, and how to talk about it, how to address it, and so on. So in order to understand and address racism, individuals need to have a clear understanding of what it is and how it operates. It's also important for them to recognize what they have internalized about themselves and about others, and some of this is totally unconscious, and how that could affect their interactions with others. Participants are encouraged to identify the relearning they need to do in order to be allies and supporters. When we talk about racism, we identify the three groups of people: Indigenous people, people of color, and white people, each of which affect and are affected by racism differently. The three groups that have been identified above must be named in order to understand racism and how it works. For example, in Canada, our systems, for the most part, have been designed by and for white people, which means that white people have benefits within these systems that people of color and Indigenous people do not have. And although this is not intentional racism, it is racism. And this is something that we need to talk about. It's also something that can cause very uneasy feelings for participants. We make every effort to create an environment where people feel safe to discuss racism. But nevertheless, talking about racism can result in feelings for participants that may be difficult to understand and to deal with in the moment. However, understanding racism is very important for everyone, regardless of their background. For white people, it helps to understand socialization and can lead to a commitment to uncover and unlearn biases and to be allies for people of color and Indigenous people. For people of color and Indigenous people, it can legitimize feelings and experiences that they may have had or are having. Understanding racism helps all individuals to make sense of their lived experiences. And finally, for folks involved in anti-racism work, and particularly in this time of COVID-19, the ensuing and ongoing attacks of racism against people of color, particularly people perceived to be of Southeast Asian heritage, it can be overwhelming work. Finding allies, people you can talk to, people you can debrief with, who understand the work you're doing and the issues that some of that work may raise for you is very important. I always have allies in my life, and I like to think that those allies do support me and my work. Some of those allies are at work, some of those allies are friends, but it's really important for me as a human rights educator and as an anti-racism worker to be able to have people that I can talk to. Okay, so I think Martha is going to take over and do some guidelines for us working together, and she's going to talk about our agenda for the next hour or so.
So the guidelines you can see are giving us a sense of the work that you can do and the experience you might have in this presentation. Keep confidential everything that others share. What's important is to let people tell their own stories and not for us to take the story away from them or use them. Sometimes people offer you permission to use their example, in which case it's okay to do that. Ask for clarification during questions at the end if something was unclear. You can make a note of it or even comment in the chat, and so we can get to any questions of clarification. Also, when we talk about using respectful language in referring to racist slurs, jokes, or comments, please do not repeat it. And if you're uncomfortable, please sit with the discomfort. Sit with it and stay with us as we work these things through together. Next slide, please, Tony. These are the things we're going to cover. I think at the beginning, Pamela mentioned that we often do 1, 2, and 3 day work. So we're going to try to be pithy, one of my favorite words, at the same time cover things in enough depth so that you get some understanding of them. Pamela's going to talk about the aspects of history, terminology related to this area. Then we'll look at the exclusion exercise, the ways that we exclude. And then finally, we're going to look at the importance of self-awareness, starting with our own sense and our own understanding and our own dealing with culture. Finally, we're going to look at the COVID-19 and racism issues. They're their abundance, but we're not wanting to get into great stories about all the experiences. Somehow repeating those stories seems to just give them more power. That looking finally at strategies, Pamela and I will talk about how we can approach these things in our own life, both standing up when we feel something is a violation of human rights and racism, and other ones where perhaps there's a way to stand with someone or speak up or intervene. We'll look at resources finally, both the resource lists that are available online and also some of the ones we'll discuss. And then finally, there's questions. And that's when, if you've made notes in the beginning of the chat, or if you saved them as notes on your side piece of paper, you can bring those up to us, and we look forward to hear from you. I'm excited that there's people from across the country and that you share our interest and our passion in human rights and anti-racism. So Pamela's going to continue on with one of my favorite parts, which is the incredible history we've gone through.
Yes, yes. When we were putting this, thanks Martha, when we were putting this program together, I wanted to leave out the history, and Martha said, no, 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 there are aspects of history you have to talk about, because we can't make the assumption that everybody knows about these aspects. And she reminded me that whenever we do this workshop face-to-face, that I would say over 3/4 of participants are surprised by some of the elements of history. So next slide, please, Tony. So, you know, we always ask, do we have a history of racism? And sometimes people say yes, sometimes they look confused, you know, as if they don't really know. And I do know that some people do believe we don't have any kind of a history of racism, but we do have a history of legalized racism and exclusion, and many incidents and events that have gone unchallenged in the past. Now, some of the history you may know are things like the Indian Act, residential schools, the Chinese Head Tax Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Japanese internment. But here are some other aspects of history you may not know. Now, this is available as a handout, and it's 4 pages. At the Research Center, we have a history of racism in Canada, which is actually 14 pages long. And so these are excerpts from that history. So the first one I want to refer to is in 1850, when the Ontario government introduced the Schools Act, which segregated African Canadians. Often people say, oh, we didn't have segregation in Canada, but segregation was alive and well, not only in Ontario, but also in Nova Scotia and various other parts of Canada. That act was not eliminated, segregation in Ontario was not eliminated until 1964. In 1876, the Canadian government passed the Indian Act, making Indigenous peoples wards of the state. That act promoted Indigenous assimilation into Anglo-Canadian society. In 1885, the government passed the Chinese Immigration and Head Tax Act, requiring Chinese men to pay a head tax, which increased from $50 in 1888 to $500, or 2 years' salary by 1903. Women and children were excluded and had to be left behind. This was not lifted until 1923, but it was replaced by the Chinese Exclusion Act, which effectively stopped immigration from China until that was repealed in 1947. So when I was looking at this a few days ago, it occurred to me that here there's a bit of deja vu, because there are folks now calling for a ban on immigration from China. In 1892, there were anti-Chinese sentiments in Calgary. There were movements to segregate them in Lethbridge and Calgary. There was the banning of employment of white women in Chinese-owned stores, and there were anti-Chinese riots in Calgary. Now, very few Chinese men were able to bring their wives over with them. And so in 1911, there were about 1,787 Chinese in Alberta, with only 20 of them being Chinese women. In 1893, the Canadian government forced Indigenous people's children to leave their families to attend residential schools. The last of these schools closed in 1996. So they're in existence for over 100 years. The residential school system was an attempt to shape the future of Canada's Indigenous peoples by removing thousands of children from their homes and communities and placing them in the care of strangers. In 1895, people of Chinese, Japanese, and East Indian heritage were denied the vote in British Columbia. People of Chinese and East Indian heritage regained the vote in 1947, and those of Japanese heritage in 1949. In 1907, there were race riots in Vancouver directed against Chinese, Japanese, and East Indian immigrants. In 1908, the federal government passed the Continuous Passage Law. That law stated that all immigrants seeking entry must come to Canada by continuous journey and through tickets from the country of their birth or citizenship. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. In 1910, there was a federal immigration law that allowed for the rejection of immigrants, I quote, belonging to any race deemed unsuitable to the climate or requirements of Canada, end quote, or who, because of their customs or habits, were expected to have difficulties in becoming assimilated. In 1911, there was a Lethbridge Member of Parliament who spoke in Edmonton opposing a wave of Black farmers coming from Oklahoma. His speech, I quote, "We want no dark spots in Alberta," end quote, defined his opposition. He spoke about different classes of Albertans, saying that Black people were among the lowest class and unable to properly integrate in Alberta. He closed his argument with, and I quote, "We do not want our province black in spots," end quote. Now, I had talked about the Continuous Passage Law. And in 1914, there was the Komagata Maru incident in Vancouver Harbor. Because of the Continuous Passage Law, a boatload of about 400 would-be immigrants from India sailed directly from Calcutta, India. They were not allowed to land. The boat sat in the harbor for nearly 3 months before it was forced out of the harbor by the Canadian Navy. And we're told that there were many people who died as a result. The only people who were allowed to land were people from India who were already living in Canada. In 1923, there was a special immigration act known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that barred all Chinese immigrants from entering Canada. This virtually stopped the immigration of Chinese people until that act was repealed in 1947. In 1924, the Ku Klux Klan organizers first came to Alberta. And by 1930, the Klan had 11 locals throughout the province. And they claimed as many as 7,000 members. Anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic movements also took root. In the 1930s, in Edmonton, there was a Klan-controlled newspaper called The Liberator. And that newspaper published hateful things and spread xenophobia. In 1931, the Ku Klux Klan celebrated Daniel Knott's mayoral victory by lighting a fiery cross on Connors Hill. Knott gave the KKK permission to burn crosses at least twice at the Edmonton Exhibition Grounds, the Northland Grounds. In 1939, 907 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution were aboard SS St. Louis, and they were denied entry into Canada. And that ship was forced to return to Nazi Germany, where many of them died. Now, that ship sailed around the world and was denied landing rights and entry by every country it visited. That journey was chronicled, or I should say, in the film, The Voyage of the Damned. In 1942, the Canadian government ordered Canadians of Japanese heritage to evacuate their homes and leave coastal British Columbia to move to internment camps in the BC interior or farms on the prairies. The National Film Board has quite a few films about these events. And this entry surprised me when I learned about it. In 1945, the University of Manitoba was the first Canadian university to remove admission quotas against Jews and other non-preferred groups. From 1945 to the present, Polish, Hungarian, Latin American, Vietnamese, Sudanese, Rwandan, Middle Eastern, and other refugees have flown war-torn countries to move to Canada to escape persecution and hardships. In 1952, Indigenous peoples in Canada were given citizenship status and the right to vote. In the mid-1960s, until this time, Indigenous people had to pay for a pass to legally leave their reserves. This was instituted in 1885, and Indigenous people were arrested if found off reserve without a pass. This pass law was modified in the 1950s, but wasn't abolished until the mid-1960s. In 1975, the city of Windsor, Ontario, desegregated its public facilities. And as Heather mentioned, in 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, guaranteeing everyone equality under the law. In 1985, as Heather mentioned too, Alberta teacher James Keekstra was charged for willful promotion of hatred against Jews. He taught his students for many years that the Holocaust never happened. And he only got, I guess, officially found out when one parent found out what he was teaching his grade 12 class and reported him. In 1988, the Canadian government signed a redress agreement with the National Association of Japanese Canadians, acknowledging that their internment during World War II violated their human rights. Some of you may remember this. In 1989 to 1990, there was a national controversy over whether Sikhs should be allowed to wear turbans in the RCMP. There were petitions tabled in the House of Commons, there were racist pins created, and there were calendars with turban-clad Mounties. And these all appeared across Canada. And this whole thing started right here in Alberta. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Indigenous Peoples report was issued. And that contained progressive ideas about the place of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, in 1999, there were 128 hate crimes reported in Calgary, and police suggested, and they continue to suggest, that the number of crimes reported is just 10% or even less than 10% of actual hate crimes committed. The majority of hate crimes are usually race-related, and the next large category is gay and lesbian bashing. You may also remember this. In 2009, during the H1N1 influenza outbreak, body bags were sent to reserves in northern Manitoba instead of vaccines and other medications. I heard a reference to this recently on the TV. In 2012, Statistics Canada Police Department said that across Canada, there were 1,401 hate crimes in 2010. That is approximately 4.1 hate crimes per 100,000 populations. In 2016, you may also remember this because it was on the TV for several days. In 2016, an Edmontonian, an actor and former high jump champion, who confronted someone while yelling racial slurs, all of which was caught on video, says he would like to thank the man. And I'm quoting, "What he did has given me and my city and the country an opportunity to talk about something that needs to be talked about," end quote, said Jesse Lipscomb. Lipscomb, who is Black, was shooting a public service announcement in Edmonton's downtown about how great the city is. In 2017, police in Canada confirmed that hate crimes rose from 1,167 in 2016 to 2,073 in 2017. And again, they estimate that only 10% or even less than 10% are reported to police. And that is because people are afraid of reprisals, and they're afraid of being targeted or retargeted. Recent studies conducted by the Organization for the Prevention of Violence indicate a significant increase in reported hate crimes in Alberta. A recently released report from the Organization for the Prevention of Violence, entitled "Extremism and Hate-Motivated Violence in Alberta," indicates a 78% increase in hate crimes reported to police from 2014 to 2017, and identified several extremist groups of threat to Alberta. So that, I think, is pretty
I've highlighted a question. Yeah, I've highlighted a question here at the bottom for people to maybe think about and type into, just to kind of reflect on what fact or what historical reference is most surprising to you about this history. Because there's a lot of things that we haven't heard before, a lot of things that haven't been taught in schools. And so if you take a moment to maybe think about what most surprised you about that list.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tony. I was going to suggest that people take a few moments to do that, to think about the things that they've heard and to just make some notes about them, either notes or opportunities for questions at the end. So let's take about 3 minutes to do that. Also, make a note about if there were any surprises for you.
This is a bit of a break for people, and so if you want to get a coffee, if you want to get a tea, if you want to maybe get up and stretch and continue to think about that list of information. I've sent it out to most people. If I haven't got you on my list, make sure that you send me your email and I'll send you along the list of all the resources we've been provided by the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center.
I'm going to take advantage of that 3-minute break.
Yes, Brian, I think that's an interesting one.
He always with me.
Tend not to think about that, the prevalence of the KKK, but there were quite formidable force in Quebec and in Ontario at the time, and in Calgary and other areas. And so we've had, there was a time when they were talking about the development of a northern homeland in the northwest United States region, just under British Columbia. And they wanted to call it Cascadia. And so they had a lot of groups that were fairly prevalent along the mountain ranges. And so when you hear some of the more current militia groups, they are descendants of that early movement there, and they continue to promote their ideas, and there's a lot of areas within that Idaho and Montana region where there is a lot of hate groups or militia groups or white supremacist groups in those areas.
Yes. Yes, they were. Okay, are we ready to move on?
I think so. And people can keep adding their comments. And if you have any questions, be sure to continue. Yes, with the anti-racist efforts and anti-racist information, we'll be passing that along as well. And I'll be going to be putting up a page in association with the region and at McDougall United Church, where we can present some of that material. I want to do a blog kind of recapping these sessions and offer some resources for people to click on and be able to get more information. We'll try to build up the database there. So yes, turn it back to Pamela.
Okay, so I think according to our agenda, now we're going to look at some key terminology, and Martha's going to take us through that.
Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about culture and the culture iceberg. Then we'll look at stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and how they all build on each other. Racism and racial discrimination deserves time. Liberal racism and xenophobia. And so if you move to the next slide, please, we're talking about culture. Now, in the broadest sense, a sum total of ways of living, including values and beliefs and aesthetic standards, verbal expression, patterns of thinking, behavioral norms, styles of communication. Basically, it's all that we are. Culture and people are all a part of it. We interact, and culture's not static. It's a living thing. And culture is the response of a group of human beings to valid and particular needs of its members. So what we're looking at is the broadest sense of culture. Can you put up the next picture? There we go. We're looking at an iceberg. And the top 1/10 of the iceberg is what you can see. That's what we refer to as the surface culture. Sometimes people, think of it as the dance, the dress, and the cooking, right? The dishes, the dance, the dress. And what we're looking at is the surface that's visible, but the largest capacity of our, looking at the iceberg of our culture lies under the water, and it's including all kinds of things. The concept of beauty, differences in how we raise our children in governance. And I know that Pamela hopefully can tell you a story about that in her time when we talk about how to be with people of different cultures. But what we're looking at is, how do people problem solve? What is the status and mobility that goes on for people in various cultural groups? Issues about whether we're independence focused or whether we're more collaborative or community cooperative as a larger group. Are you looking after your family's beliefs? And that's all deep in the culture. Your sense of humor, notions of leadership. Gender relationships are often instilled in cultural norms. Often this is not only unconscious and beneath the surface, but maybe not even spelled out specifically within the given group. Different facial expressions, body language. As we look at them, one of the things that I know we talk about is being able to see people for the individual they are and to not get caught up in typecasting, because the nuances within a group are profound, as well as the collective understood cultural differences. So as we move on from culture to our next slide, we're going to look at all kinds of terms that are involved in our work that we do. And as I said before, they build on each other. So what we have here is the first one's a stereotype, right? So a stereotype is a standardized mental picture or assumption about certain individuals and groups. Stereotyping is making general assumptions without knowing all the facts or even any of the facts. A stereotype assumes that all members of the group share some general qualities. For example, they're smart, they're hardworking, they're bad drivers. Stereotypes of people or groups can be derogatory, can lead to prejudice and discrimination. So we're saying a whole group is like this. So building on stereotypes now, we move to prejudice. Prejudice, I want to tell you that the definitions are available on the Alberta Civil Liberties and Research Center websites, and we'll say more of that in the resources at the end. But prejudice is our next step after stereotypes. Prejudice is a judgment or an opinion formed beforehand or without thoughtful examination of the facts and issues. A judgment about a person without knowing them. Prejudice often manifests itself in irrational hatred and dislike of particular groups, race, religion. Now we're getting into moving from a stereotype of grouping folks together to some very strong judgments and opinions that are moving forward. So moving down the line, we're going to move into discrimination. Discrimination's treating a person or a group of people unfairly, usually because of the prejudice about the person's race, ethnic background, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ability, other characteristics, or denying them a privilege, benefit, or opportunity that's enjoyed by others because of their race, ethnic background, religion, citizenship, family status, disability, sexual orientation, and other personal characteristics. Discrimination is an action that results from the prejudice. So you can see how they all build onto each other. So as we move into racism now, racism is a belief that a particular group is superior or inferior based on those supposed racial differences. Racism is reinforced by individual behaviors, 1, 2, ways of thinking and stereotypes, and 3, institutional practices and policies and procedures. Racism is any individual action or institutional practice which treats people differently because of their color and ethnicity. This distinction is often used to justify discrimination. Now, a lot of my familiarity in this area comes from my work with the Congolese and the Rwandans. And I think that looking at the distinctions even within Canada, as the history shows, you know, it's there for us too. Racial discrimination. Racial discrimination is the discrimination based on race that stems from conscious and often unconscious sense. Xenophobia, liberal racism. I just about forgot that one. It's sort of interesting. It's kind of a culture of individualism. I know that I was raised that way. Anybody who wants to can pull themselves up by the birth, you know, by bootstraps. We can all be successful. Kind of a sense that anybody who wants can achieve, which completely disregards people of color and indigenous people who are not having the opportunities because of the racism that's systemic as well as individual. The other thing is you'll hear a person with fine intent say, so Pamela, where are you from? As if she, you know, like, what, Toronto? No, I mean, where are you really from? I'm trying, you know, my intention, I think, is to help her, you know, to get to know her and to feel inclusive. And that's not how it comes across, does it, Pamela?
No. Because it tends to suggest that, but, you know, particularly if you say, oh, Calgary, and they say, no, before Calgary. And you say, well, I lived in Toronto for 10 years. And they say, no, before that. Where were you born? Or where are your parents from? It negates the fact that you could be from where you say you're from.
Yeah, and I think, Pamela, you've made the distinction sometimes that sometimes people from a given community are thinking, oh, you might be from, you know, Uganda where I am. And so, you know, I mean, there's a sense of familiarity of people who are acting as a sense of connecting. And there are other people who are acting in a way that is liberal racism in its finest form.
I think a good way to put it is that when people of color ask each other that question, it's usually about making connections.
Yeah.
When Aboriginal people ask that question of each other, it's again making connections. But when a white person asks a person of color, they have to be really careful because, you know, saying, so Joanne, where are you from? And Joanne says, Toronto. The person goes, before Toronto, or where are your grandparents from? Or like the example of someone we both know who gets asked, where are you from? She says, High River. And then she gets, yeah, but where are your parents from? High River. Your grandparents? High River. Family's been in High River since the turn of the 18th into the 19th into the 20th century, right? And so it gives me a bit of a chuckle because people are not accepting that she could have been born and bred and raised and grew up and everything, all of those words in High River.
I think one of the things that strikes me in these terms is that in some ways, there are efforts that actually exclude someone, as if to say, you're not really us, or from there. There's some communities around the world where they say you're not really from Belfast unless you have 3 generations of history behind you. So I understand that this is certainly something, but it's something that excludes people. And as our next slide will talk about exclusion, Pamela's going to go into greater detail of what that looks like and how it happens.
Yeah, so this is actually one of my favorite exercises, activities when we're doing our anti-racism training, because it really is meant to help us think about our biases. We all have them, and where we might have learned them, how they affect our behavior, albeit unconsciously. You know, we never stop to think about this until we're forced to. So this exercise can actually be used to look at any ism, not just racism. So we could look at sexism, ageism, heterosexism, and so on. So as I said, it helps us look at where we learn about racism, what we internalize, beliefs, albeit unconsciously, as I said, and how that can affect our behaviors. So we usually will break a group of participants into 3 smaller groups. And group 1 will look at the places we learn to exclude. And I usually say to them, everywhere is not an answer. You have to list the places. Group number 2 looks at the beliefs that are out there that exist about others. And we usually ask that group not to list people, but to simply say, those people are. And then the 3rd group looks at the things we do to exclude, the behaviors that we have, and albeit again unconsciously, which exclude others. I mean, some of the behaviors are deliberate, but most of them are unconscious. Next slide. So these are some of the places we learn to exclude. And sometimes groups have all of these items, sometimes they've got more, but these are the major places where we learn to exclude. So our family gatherings, our judicial system, community organizations, sports teams, the media, schools, in the education system, religious institutions, boards, transportation, government, workplaces. And, you know, whenever I say that religious institutions, I'm remembering that when I went to high school, it was an Anglican high school. And whenever we had our commemoration ceremony every year, the Roman Catholic students in the school said they couldn't attend because they weren't allowed to go to other churches. And similarly at that time, it was said that non-Roman Catholic people weren't encouraged or to attend Roman Catholic churches. So that's what that reminds me of. Now, it was a while ago and this no longer exists. But think of what those students learned about exclusion in the name of religion. Next slide, please. So this group looked at the things we do to exclude, some of the behaviors. So we ignore people. We spend time or we join groups of people who are most like us. For example, in the lunchroom or when we get together after work, who sits with who goes to lunch with who goes for a drink with who, and who gets left out. Stereotyping, name calling, silence when somebody speaks, or saying, why can't we just do things the way it's always been? Why do I have to choose? Why do we have to include those people? Using jargon, perhaps talking too quickly, too slowly, interrupting, using sarcasm, inappropriate humor, for example, telling cultural jokes or making fun of someone's cultural practices or beliefs or foods. I've heard many a tale about that happening in lunchrooms. Denying difference or someone's experience. Even saying something like, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see difference, makes the person that you're saying it to feel, uh-oh, what's this person really trying to say? Being ignorant, not learning, resisting change, denying someone's experiences, and being nosy. Next slide, please. And this is where we come to the beliefs. So those people are bad drivers. They take all our jobs. They're alcoholics. They're gang members, or they're pimps. They're good at math, and they're good athletes. They're religious fanatics. They're terrorists. They eat smelly food, and they have body odor. They drive big fancy cars. They live off the government and expect a free handout. Those people are not normal. Those people eat too much. Those people are lazy. Those people require too much accommodation to hire, and they won't be able to do the job. Next slide, please. So what we've created is the triangle of, in this case, racism. And that triangle works in all directions, and I'll say a little bit more about it. So in looking at the places we learn, those are the institutions down towards the bottom left. In looking at the things we do, those are the individual actions, the behaviors. And in looking at the beliefs, we've constructed the ideology. So the triangle goes in all directions. We can learn something in our family, believe it, that's the ideology, causes us to behave in a certain way. Or we can hear something, ideology, take it into one of the institutions we're a part of, or family or workplace or team, and then behave in a certain way. So the triangle goes in any direction. The place where you can make a personal difference is at the individual level. Because when you hear some of the ideology, you can question it. You can say, really? All of those people who drive big fancy cars are pimps? You can ask people that you hear promoting this ideology to think about what they're saying. You can question them about where they got their information. And hopefully, by questioning some of the things you hear, and in your workplace, some of the policies which are exclusionary, you can hope to make change. But the place that it starts is with the individual. Okay.
Next slide.
Next slide, please.
It starts with the individual. Thank you, Pamela. Self-awareness, interacting with others. It's our task when we look at ourselves and we think, oh dear, you know, I think I've done and said some of those, to know that, you know, we're human. And the way to start to address some of these things is with self-awareness. Our task of personal reflection and growth. Unfortunately, it's not a done deal. It's an ongoing piece. And I have to say at 72, last night I had a wake-up call. I talked to one of my sons who is going to work in the United States, and I had some I had some grouping of people who tend to follow the yellow-haired leader. And I was reminded that that is a way of identifying a massive group and doing the very thing that my son pointed out that I teach about. So, in all humility, I say that we must start with our own self-knowledge and our own self-reflection and our own self-awareness, and hopefully allies and people around us we love and trust who will kind of remind us when we're not practicing what we're preaching. So I would say that we look at socialization, and then we look also at cultural identity. And I'm going to invite you to look at socialization in some different ways, because we have the influences of family and community and school, education, community. If you asked yourself a question, how do I feel about X, a community of people? For me, I think growing up, I did not have very much awareness at all of Indigenous communities. What were my family's experiences of those? What were their attitudes? What were my family behaviors? What did I learn in personal experiences in school or in my community? Did I have negative experiences that left me with some that prevent success because I can typecast? Were there good experiences that helped me see a group of people that I didn't have personal experience with? What did I learn in school? I can answer that, nothing, really. But what were the representations in books and media and TV? Back in the day, I've told you already how old I am, so you know that I watched, TV things that were influential. When we're looking at communities of groups of people that I was part of growing up, were they diverse? Were they representatives from many different cultural groups? Or was it sort of a homogeneous group without much experience or exposure or learning with other people who had a diverse background from my own? What were the models that I saw and that I had? And what were they saying and what were they speaking about? So I think that we can look at the things that aided in our successes. My mom and dad raised me like my two brothers, no male gender benefits. So that was a help for me. But I think there are people who were raised with a cultural background that said that women were less able than males and various things like that. Your self-reflection can be done in journaling, talking with others, attending workshops like Pamela and I and Heather are teaching, but really to spend the time to have in-depth looks. I know that Tony said that you had some groups that were looking even at white privilege. It takes courage to look at these things deeply, and it also takes a supportive community to be able to work it through. Right, Pamela?
Yes, absolutely. Because, I'm thinking, as you're talking, Martha, I'm remembering Thandika, who's one of the references. She was doing research for her book, which is called Learning to be White. And her argument is that everybody, regardless of your racial background, learns what it is to be white. Anyway, and she interviewed this woman who was a white woman who was about in her 30s. And as the woman was relaying an experience to her from when she was about 6, she was in tears. At her school, an African-American girl joined the class. I think they were in grade 1. I don't think they were grade 2. Anyway, she and this little girl talked and played during recess. They had a great time together. She asked her mom, "Can I invite Jennifer around for tea?" And the mom said, "Yes, of course." So she was all excited, and the day Jennifer was to come, she was jumping up and down, and the doorbell rang. She ran to the door, opened it, and her mom was right behind her. She said in the split second that she opened the door and saw Jennifer there and was about, and greeted her, she knew she could never invite Jennifer again. She said her mom didn't say anything. As a matter of fact, her mom was very charming throughout the whole visit. But she knew she had made a mistake in inviting that little African-American girl to her home. Could have been, she didn't say, but could have been her mother took an intake of breath. Could have been she made a step back. Who knows? But it made me very aware reading this that we have to be so careful with our little people, because we might think they don't notice things, but they do. They notice the slightest change in behavior and the slightest reaction we make. And so there was this young woman crying in her 30s as she recalled this incident, right? And how that had a traumatic effect on her and on her identity.
And the things that you give as examples are the things that prevent success. They unconsciously set her up for her belief that this child she wanted to play with so desperately was not welcome in her own home. And it didn't take her mother saying, no, don't bring people over, but she could read it. So I think that when we look at the things that prevent our successes of socialization and self-awareness, there are examples like that, Pamela, and isolated incidents that now seem so indicative of affecting your own behavior and socialization.
Yes.
The last piece about cultural identity looks at values, beliefs, assumptions, perceptions, biases, life experiences. When we talk to the people who have the shared culture with us, we are able to kind of perhaps even maybe see in other people the beginnings of something to look at our own culture. That whole white, the white privilege was something that was brought home to me when I was in other places and other communities around the world in Sri Lanka, and people would still defer to me as a white person speaking, not because I was bright or had anything to say or, was the only one, but white privilege is something that sometimes we're unconscious and unaware of.
Absolutely. Yep.
So this is something that we could easily talk. I'm sure your white privilege group has a lot of time to explore too and talk. And I think that the work you're trying to do in these ethics series and in-depth looking is really a gift to each other of saying, I don't want to participate in a culture now that leaves people out, that excludes people, that unconsciously creates that message. You are not welcome here. So I think as we move on from this, I want Pamela's going to talk, we'll come back to the things we can do beyond self-awareness to do in these situations. But Pamela's going to talk about some of our leaders who are standing up and stepping up at this point to give some leadership and guidance to us as we persist. So Tony, next slide, please. Thanks.
So there have been leaders of human rights organizations who've been expressing concern over the incidents of racism and xenophobia that have been happening around the world and here in Canada and even locally in Alberta. And we will recall our Prime Minister denouncing the, I think, very racist comments made by a member of Parliament, a Conservative member of Parliament, about our Chief Public Health Officer. I'm not going to repeat what he said, but the Prime Minister said that that kind of attitude and statement has no place in our Canada. So I have, in preparing for this, this presentation, and I've talked to Martha and Heather about this, I have become saturated with information in preparing for this presentation. The incidents can affect you, particularly if you're a person of color or have close relatives or friends who may be targeted, who may have been targeted, or who you fear may be targeted. So I want you to be very aware of that. Now, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said, "We must act now to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate." He also said, "COVID-19 doesn't care who we are, where we live, what we believe, or about any other distinction. We need every ounce of solidarity to tackle it together." Yet the pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering. Anti-foreigner sentiment has surged online and in the streets, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have spread. COVID-related anti-Muslim attacks have occurred. Next slide, please. Migrants and refugees have been vilified as a source of the virus and then denied access to medical treatment. And with older persons among the most vulnerable, contemptible memes have emerged suggesting that they are also the most expendable. And he says, "And I ask everyone, everywhere, to stand up against hate, to treat each other with dignity and take every opportunity to spread kindness." Next slide, please. And our own Marie-Claude Landry, Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, said, "The Canadian Human Rights Commission is deeply concerned by the rise of racism across Canada since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Minority groups, in particular people of Asian origin, have been the victims of racist taunts, threats, and intimidation in public and online, and physical violence. This is both an issue of public safety and fundamental human rights. No one should feel threatened or unwelcome because of the color of their skin or where they're from." Next slide, please. Racism and xenophobia are also contributing to misinformation during a global health crisis. Viruses don't have borders. Viruses do not discriminate. People do. Flattening the curve and slowing the spread of COVID-19 will take cooperation, solidarity, and unity. As a country built on diversity, freedom, and inclusion, we cannot let racism, intolerance, and inequality undermine our peace and our prosperity. We are not safe unless we are all safe. Next slide, please. And our own Michael Gottheil, Chief of the Human Rights Commission and Tribunals of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, said, "The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all our lives in many ways, and unfortunately, it has led to an increase in racism and discrimination towards certain groups of Canadians. Since the beginning of this crisis, minority groups in Alberta, especially people of Asian descent, have been the targets of racist comments, threats, and intimidation. And even though it may be human nature to want to assign blame or lash out in difficult times," next slide, please. "Racism and xenophobia are also contributing to I think it's the next two slides. Yeah, the next one to that. What's happening?
Not sure. That's the one that follows, and then it goes into.
Yes, and what's the next one after this? Yeah, we must be vigilant against xenophobia.
Okay.
To fight this pandemic, we need to look after one another by reaching out to our fellow Albertans and showing compassion, care, and consideration. We know that racism and discrimination will not stop when this pandemic ends, and may even worsen for some within our communities. As we begin to ease restrictions and gradually move towards recovery, it is crucial that all spaces are free from hate, racism and xenophobia, and that all Albertans feel safe. And now Martha is going to talk about some of the examples that have been examples of hate and xenophobia that have been occurring. Next slide, please.
So in COVID-19 and racism, there are several examples, and our goal is not to just keep duplicating them, to repeat them and actually give them more power, but we want to cite the number and overwhelming nature of them. 24 hate crimes in Vancouver: pushing, shoving, spitting, physical attacks, being taunted while taking public transit, screamed at a grocery store, attacks on folks of Chinese heritage and other racial heritages. Vancouver Chinese Cultural Center: 4 large glass windows were defaced with racist remarks from Asians, and a bench in the Queen Elizabeth Park was dedicated to Chinese Canadian couple, was also defaced with racist remarks. Man charged with a hate crime in Calgary, threatening to intentionally spread the virus to Indigenous people. Next slide. Many verbal attacks in High River, Alberta, and Cargill meat plant workers of Philippine heritage. Cases of racism and hate crimes, including vandalism, xenophobia, physical intimidation directed at folks of Chinese heritage or who look so in Montreal, defacing statues, a Quanam temple, attacks on other even non-Chinese folks of color, vandalism and temples, synagogues, and mosques. Brian Adams' Instagram rant about being forced to cancel concerts, widely condemned as racist and inflammatory. Next one, thank you. Supportive responses denouncing, before we leave off, okay, I was going to say something. I have one more thing coming along. So these are support responses denouncing racism and xenophobia. Sim Lu, Kim's Convenience, Amy Go, Chinese Canadian National Council Social Justice launched Stop the Spread campaign aimed at combating racism related to the coronavirus. One that I have here that's not on the scale is Kenneth Lin, a co-chairman of the Chinese Canadian National Council in Toronto, said, Canadians who aren't in these communities or aren't being targeted need to stand up for those that are being targeted. Like the 92-year-old man who was pushed and fell and hit his head, she said. Bystanders simply walked past him on the ground, she added. It can be verbal assaults at a supermarket or online. Really challenge and speak out in those moments to call out what is not right. And in this example, the people who walked through should have done something, she said. It's on-the-spot moments calling incidents out. She also said her organization has been receiving hateful voicemails, emails, and problems. I have Kenneth Lin, who I just quoted here, and Dr. Kenneth Fung of protect.ca, a pandemic rapid response optimalism to enhance community resilience and health, is a rapid response community-based action research project. Next slide. Tony? There we go, thank. Protect launched multilingual online resources to address COVID mental health and social impact on Chinese Canadians. BC selected the Victoria Immigrant and Refugee Center Society, VIRCS, to take on systemic and institutionalized racism throughout the province. CCCSA, Calgary Chinese Community Services Association, many of these resources offer support on the phone and perhaps on the internet for people who wish and need assistance. Is that right, Pamela? They offer?
Yes, what they're all saying is that And people of Asian heritage tend not to want to make a fuss. They tend not to want to make complaints. And so in each of these organizations, there's a facility for people to either phone in things that have happened to them, or to leave, write in and tell and say what has happened to them. And there are people available to offer support.
Okay, thank you.
Because
Yeah.
one of the values of Asian culture is harmony, and not wanting to create disturbances or to draw attention to oneself.
Yes, and that makes even that 10% who complain about mistreatment in our province statistics as even probably smaller than that. What we're moving on to, and remember you can ask questions if we're going too fast through these things, is we're going to look now at strategies to deal with cultural differences. What can we do that can help us address these things? I know for me, when I'm reflecting on my own behavior and my own learnings, these pages are very helpful. On this actual list that you can get as a handout from Tony, there are 18 different things. I've just highlighted a couple of them. Respect for personal names, and I want you to tell your story, Pamela.
Oh, we and Heather might remember this. We had a new member of staff at work some years ago, and when I was being told about her, I was told that she said to call her Sharon. And I said, what's her name? And I was told, well, it's Sharonjeet Kaur. She wouldn't mind me sharing this. And I said, why are we calling her Sharon if her name is Sharonjeet? And the person said, well, that's what she says people call her. She just wants to make it easier. I said, nope, I'm calling her Sharonjeet. That is her name. And I will not be calling her Sharon. And it was interesting because I would say like a week later, everybody in the office was calling her by her correct name. Now, Sharonjeet's not a difficult name to say, is it? Right? And regardless of if the name is difficult or not, we need to learn to say it. And we need to find out, why is somebody asking me to call her this name when her name is something else? Right?
Yes.
Does it make life easier for me and everybody else? Or does she really see herself as a Sharon?
Yes.
One of the things that, and I'm going to say it, one of the things that bugs me is I could introduce myself to somebody as Pamela, and 2 seconds later they're saying, so Pam, how are we going to do this?
Don't do
And
that.
I'm going, I am not a Pam. But anyway, yes. So I believe that
The personal name is important.
it is. I mean, if somebody's name is Stephanie, like my very good friend, and she says, look, I've been called Steph ever since I was little. I just prefer that. Then that's different. For me anyway, right? It's a contraction of her name that she's comfortable with.
It's important to know the name and find out what their name is and how to pronounce it. Also to be aware of not using slang terms or dear or missy or something that's also an adaptation. We want to be called and seen by who we are. And our name is part of that, a big part of that.
Yeah.
I've also highlighted here, notice the economic and social divide lines, and we're looking at in the workplace, in the community. If you're on the privileged side of the line, be sensitive to the needs and the feelings of those who aren't. And I'm thinking of the school we were working with, Pamela, and you were talking about an incident that happened there.
Okay, yeah, we were going to have an art show, and the school is in the community of Marlborough. And my suggestion was that we have the art show in Marlborough. But some of my colleagues wanted to have it at an art, what's it called? An art gallery. And my argument was that it would be difficult for parents to get to the art gallery, and that we needed to have events in places where people live, right? And as it turned out, we had a lovely show at the art gallery, but no parents showed up. And none of the kids, well, only 2 of the kids showed up, the ones who were scheduled to do a presentation. And so I think that was a learning for everybody, because this year we planned to have it at the Marlborough Community Center.
Yes.
It's actually going to be online now, but you know, we need to have things where people live. We need to meet people where they live and where they gather, not where we would like them to be because it's a exclusive place, it looks good and all of that kind of stuff.
It usually has to come to it by car, which is another distraction. Right. If you're not a car people. Be attentive to gestures, be careful of gestures and how you use them. I'm going to combine that with being very careful about touching in any way in the back. Mm-hmm. I think that our awareness has to extend. What I realized when I was working in Iraq is that men can hug each other, men can kiss, men and women do not have that same physical contact. And to not violate those norms requires one to be very aware of that person's, coming from their place and their perceptions, and not to overstep or violate with our actions of touching or gesturing.
Yes.
I also am talking about being aware of a different cultural view of time and time and space. And I was doing some work in the University of Peace in Belgium, and I was ready at 9 o'clock and the translators were all there and nobody else arrived till 10:30. But then we went all night until 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the wine cellars of the crypt, singing and talking and doing workshops for much longer than we ever would have. And I needed a nap. But also I was working in Chibougamau, who's 3 hours north of Chicoutimi. And this little boy, his family did not come into town until after freeze up. And he and I were talking, and this young man said to me, he said, "What? The teacher says, turn this in on Tuesday." He said, "What's a Tuesday if you're not a calendar people? You don't say, I'm going fishing on Tuesday. You're going fishing when the weather shifts or on the edge of a drop-off or, at daybreak. But you don't fish because it's Tuesday." So there's difference of time and space and understanding that require our consideration and respect.
Yes.
What's the only one I didn't write? Is adjust your interpersonal space requirements. Yeah. Pamela, you can add some pieces. There's 18 items, so I try and it's really painful to try to restrict all the ones that we've missed. So
I know, and I'm very aware of time and that we have one left, which is fairly big. So, but again, it's available as a handout. So I'm going to try and go through it very quickly, if that's okay, Tony.
Next slide. There you are, Tony. Thank you.
Picking up and supporting others. So this again is available as a handout. And I'm not going to go through everything just because of time. I think this is something that folks can, go through on their own if they request a copy. So these are general steps that can be used at any time, but certainly can be used now as we face increased incidents of hate and exclusion. So speaking up and standing up or standing with someone who's been or is being attacked is something we all would like to do. However, particularly in these times, we need to be prepared, and we need to look at our safety. So we need to find a way to pause from assuming or reacting right away. You could say, ouch, or if it's the first time and the incident is new, you could ask the person to repeat what they said. This gives you a few moments to think about what you're going to say or do next. If it's a physical attack, you should call the police, because your first concern must be that you are safe from physical, emotional, psychic abuse of any kind. With the hate crimes and hate incidents occurring during this pandemic, police advise against putting yourself at risk by intervening. They strongly recommend that you call 911, or if you're on public transit, to press the bell or whatever's there, the panic button or whatever's there for you to be able to get the driver to stop. A woman in Vancouver was kicked and a clump of her hair torn out after she spoke up to a man who was verbally attacking another woman on the train. She ended up in hospital. So ask yourself, what kind of personal risk will I be taking if I do this? Is this particular action worth my time, effort, risking my personal safety? And throughout this presentation, this part of the presentation, you're going to hear me say over and over again, personal safety has to be paramount. So, be ready. The first step, the first item in thinking about this is be ready, because you know that there will be a moment like this. So prepare yourself for it. Think of yourself as the person who will speak up. Summon your courage or whatever it takes to get that courage. But again, remember your safety. I often think, well, I have the courage in the moment to speak up. So in order to bolster your courage, have something in mind to say before an incident happens. So open-ended questions often are a good response. Why do you say that? How did you develop that belief? Where did you get that information? However, again, if others are stunned and like you're stunned by what happened, simply saying ouch indicates that you're responding and have more time to say something else. So identify the behavior. Sometimes pointing out the behavior helps someone hear what they're really saying or even doing. So, Janice, what I hear you saying is that all Asian people have the virus? Where did you get that from? So, and when identifying the behavior, do try to avoid labeling or name calling or the use of loaded terms. One of the things that could cause an escalation in the racist or the problematic behavior is saying that's racist, because that often gets people's back up, right? Try to help them reflect on what they're saying or doing. If it's a person that you have some sort of a relationship with, a friend, relative, co-worker, appeal to their higher principles. So, Maria, I've always thought of you as a fair-minded person. So I'm kind of shocked when I hear you say something like this. Because sometimes what a person says at one time is not really indicative of who they really are. Set limits. You can't control another person or their actions, but you can say, please don't make those comments in my presence. I don't believe that all Asian people have the virus or that they're deliberately spreading it. Or, yeah, that's right. You could say, please don't repeat any of the stuff that you hear from down south in my presence. Find an ally and be an ally. This is of critical importance in my mind. Seek out like-minded people and ask them to support you in whatever ways they can. And don't forget to return the favor. Try always to speak up and not be silenced by fear. To be an ally, we must lead by example and inspire others to do the same. However, personal safety must come first. You could turn to someone nearby and say, "Did you see what I just saw?" Or, "Shall we do something about this?" Or say to support the victim and say, "Are you okay? Can we help you?" Be vigilant, because remember that this could happen again. So stay prepared and keep speaking up. Don't risk silence, because there's always a sense of personal disappointment in not speaking up in the moment. And how many times has something happened and we can think of a really good response half an hour later? So we need to be prepared. And it's one thing to speak up in private, and by private I mean sort of at work, at home, with friends. But the difficulty comes when you have to speak up in public. So choose your own comfort level in these situations. And again, always consider personal safety, because you don't want to become the target and become a victim yourself. Yes. So again, and what can I do about my own bias? Martha talked about this. I need to look at the choices I make, the things I choose to do and not to do. So where do I choose to sit? If I'm getting on public transport, who do I look at and choose not to sit next to? If I'm entering a room, who do I make eye contact with? Who do I smile at? Who do I say hello to? And again, in developing self-awareness, remember, we all have biases, and most of these are unconscious. So be self-critical. Save someone else the trouble of confronting you. Pay attention to your everyday actions. Be conscious of how bias is affecting what you do and what you don't do. I try to be aware of this, but like Martha said, sometimes I catch myself and I go, I can't believe I just thought that.
Next slide, please.
And I can't believe what I can't believe I just said that. So change your behavior. When you catch yourself in a biased action, change course immediately and learn the lesson for good. Share your experiences. Be open with others about the biased behavior that you've demonstrated. Let others hear what you've learned and hopefully learn from you. Now, in responding, there are things that we can do to soften a response, no matter how angry we might be. So take a deep breath and soften your tone. So instead of coming across as really, really angry, as happens with me a lot of the time, you say, I don't know how to put it, but I'm really concerned about what I just heard you say. Or you could make a feeling statement. I want you to know that I can't help but feel offended by what you just said or did. Or you could be even more tentative. You could say, please correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying that all Asian people are spreading the virus? That we should ban all Asian people from entering Canada? And it's, as I said, these are all on your handout. Next slide. Oh, and there's a CBC News article that was it's also on your handout list, about actions that you could take in the face of a racist attack. The journalist talked to a couple of people who do anti-discrimination work in Vancouver and listed, I think there are about 8 actions that were recommended. Some of them you will have heard about in the handout, but some of them you might not have heard of. Like some people are saying, well, can't really call the police, they're not going to do anything. I don't believe that. I believe that to protect yourself and the victim, the police should always be called, particularly if it's a physical attack. And the next slide contains a list of resources. So I'm just going to refer to the websites. The Alberta Civil Liberties website is there. It contains, we have a wealth of information on human rights and various aspects of human rights. There's the Alberta Human Rights Commission website, again, a wealth of information on human rights. And there's the Calgary Anti-Racism Education website. It's called CARED, C-A-R-E-D. You could see that, Calgary Anti-Racism Education. That's about framing and learning anti-racism. It has a wealth of information about racism, anti-racism, and learning racism. And it's actually can be used as a self-studies resource for learning about all aspects of racism and anti-racism. It contains the list of definitions that Martha was referring to. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation also has a wealth of information and also has an amazing, I think, list of terminology. The Teaching Tolerance website is an American website, but it's also very good. It really helps you look at, there's a part of that website that helps you look at yourself. And it asks you questions like, what do I know about LGBTQ people? And then it asks you a set of questions, and it rates your level of discrimination. So you could go into one of the question sets and think, oh yeah, I know about this, and then come out realizing how little you know. So again, that's an amazing website. The rest of the resources are all books or articles. One of the ones that I'd highly recommend is, next page please, is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and also the Henry, so yes, at the bottom of this page, the DiAngelo, and then the Henry, Francis, and Tater, sorry, the Henry and Tater, Color of Democracy, Racism in Canadian Society. So that's the end of our presentation.
Great.
So
I think, we have one question there that I'd like to kind of get to just as we bring this to close, and kind of think about the question from Richard Bott saying, as I listen to this evening, the questions for me are around how to go about building these explorations into the lives of our communities of faith. So looking at how do we develop an understanding in and amongst our groups, and how we grow that development for, I think for organized religion groups. I think it's interesting because that calling is something that is inherent into what we see as the theology or the background or the mentality of the institution that says we need to do this type of work. We need to continue and contribute to that dialogue and to improve on where we are. I think one of the things that I'm glad for the people that are here, that it's not a conversation that a lot of people want to have. And so this is probably one of the lower, I thought, right on that median of people who would participate. And I expected that. I expected to see that there would be some sort of shyness about not wanting to sort of really delve into that. But I think right at the end, it was very important to kind of bring that all together. And so how do we then motivate the people in and amongst that we meet with every day, that we work with every day, that we go to church with, that we have in our communities and in our families and our extended families and social relations to begin that process? And what do you see from the mindset of the anti-racist
My
yes.
initial response would be to begin the conversation and to keep at it. But it's important to do it gently, and particularly know the people that you're dealing with, because I have a friend who is very well versed in this topic, and she says her family and other close friends call her the racism police.
Mm-hmm.
So she has learned to be gentle with people, but she does call them out. And the thing is that in calling somebody out, one has to, I guess, explain and be gentle with them and help people think about their attitudes and beliefs rather than be condemning about them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and as a leader, to be very aware of where you're coming from and how you communicate with those people that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Like, it's interesting. I think there was a question earlier from Cecile talking about shaming and about the idea of how to work through. And one of the things that one of the theologians that I always read and listen to is Christina Cleveland. One of the things that she talks about is that shame is very destructive. Mm-hmm. As a theological premise, shaming is not good to the soul, not good to to promote any sort of action. Guilt, on the other hand, is something that you can work with. Guilt is something that is actually calling for action, calling for a different way of doing something. And so there's some inherent positive direction that it's facing toward, rather than being merely condemning and merely only of one mindset.
I'm remembering a Catholic priest who was, I can't remember his name, who was talking about, he's a very strong social justice advocate in Central South America. And he said, when I feed the poor, it's considered something you celebrate and be respected for. And when I ask why they're poor and starving, they condemn me. And I think that sometimes one of the things that I remember growing up, you're talking about the United Church, it was called the Congregational Church when I was a kid, is that the minister stood up and told his own path from moving from taking societal norms to really looking at injustice and social injustice and his own growth. Sometimes when other people who are already here on this call or involved in life can say, this is my learning, and so it makes it safe. It gives this a few steps and stones for the next step to take.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. What I'd like to do is as we complete, what we usually do is we normally give people a chance to respond and to maybe leave a question or a comment on what they thought of the presentation and give them a time to speak. So we'll start off with Richard Bott, please.
Sorry, I'd just like to say thank you for this tonight. My question was really posted there, and I think it's an important one for faith communities, is to figure out how do we take this out of our heads and make it part of our lives. What I heard here tonight were some really powerful suggestions to those of us who are in this space. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Helen. Do you have Helen there? And I think we have Ayodeji, is that how you say it?
Yes, Tony Ayodeji. Thank you. Thank you. I know you can't see me for one reason or the other. I had so much problem in linking up with you. I
Oh,
should have started it earlier, but I was thinking I'll be able to get it. I all I can say is that this is not the first time I'm hearing this, but this I must say that both Pamela and Martha have done a great job again here because they have they have put on top of a good job something to make it best, and I'm really happy that I'm part of the people that had this today. So thanks so much to both Pam and Martha for giving me a better education on this team. Thank you very much.
mm-hmm.
And Ayadeji, you didn't say that you also work at the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center and that you're a human rights educator and that you're also a lawyer.
Well, there we go.
Okay.
Well,
She said it already, so I don't need to repeat.
all right, Munja.
Oh, hi. It's really appreciated. I found you on the Facebook. It's 2 hours prior to this. I'm a member of United Church. First time I face-to-face our moderator, other than the general council. And it's this task. I've been personally have many, many stories within church, outside of church. And since the 1980, even our United Church formed the racism task group. I've been involved with it. Just awareness, a softened way, awareness. But keep softening doesn't work, in my opinion. But as a moderator, Richard suggestion, we have to implement this momentum through the COVID-19. I really appreciated this happening to, we can bring up again because
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19 pandemic versus pandemic racism, which is I brought up to Shining Water Region as a commissioner of a social ecological justice commissioner and executive. So I gently but strongly brought up this time because I waited because this topic is so uncomfortable, especially mainstream, which my membership is 217-year-old mainstream church. So I slowly 3 years ago, I'm a new in Toronto at the intercultural church, Soften Way. That intercultural church ministry way is just right in our faith doctrine in United Church, seek justice. But the people surpass that. Oh, we all welcoming. But we are more than token, no longer, not cultural iceberg, no longer top part. We have to digging in. So hopefully, moderator, I'm asking you, we work more detail, fine tuning up educational tool develop, momentum of now, implement all 17 reasons for this issue, not outside, not part of a commission of policy. In the Shining Water region, we have 3 commission. None of them we have a dwelling in policy. I'm the one made a motion to change it into intercultural racism minority paragraph. I put it in last June. So we still don't want to hear. We done it. It's not done it. Not even touch of it. So hopefully this momentum by our moderator will come up strong suggestion. Only this topic, not surface of intercultural and the other welcoming. No, this special issue has to be dwelling in. And we have to develop a very fine tune up. Even monocultural too. Monocultural congregation where I am, Korean culture, we have to open up too, right? We have some degree of racism in it among the Southeastern Asian too. So this is a diverse way. This a great curriculum has to develop, not only adults, Sunday school, early age education, curriculum has to be in it, these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Cecile, are you still there or are you moved on? I saw your note in the thing that you can't stay.
I'm still here. I was just going to press the leave button.
Well, go ahead.
So just to say that I appreciate all the softening suggestions as well. Recently, I was on another webinar on similar issues, and one of the norms was if somebody makes a comment that is offensive to you, try to give them a soft landing and assume that they don't know something, that they need to be taught something more. So I'm working with that strategy for now, but this is tough stuff to deal with.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good advice. I think it humanizes people and it humanizes that experience. It makes it less than taking away those power dynamics of I'm using my racist edge, my racialized position in order to say this, versus I'm a person who is confronted by the fact that I'm between an institution of thinking and a present situation of acting. So I think that that's very important. Brian, please.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Heather and Martha and Pamela. I find every time I hear some of this, how much I need to grow and how much I need to learn. I've always thought that one of the tasks we need to do is create an environment where we can be called out, not to hurt, but to help a person to grow. And of course, we have to be willing to grow ourselves in order for that to happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lavira.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. It really hurts my heart to see that the inequality has meant that the people that work in our meat plants and our people that work in our seniors' homes they have such inequality with their workplace and with their safety and with their benefits that they aren't paid what they're worth, and their safety wasn't looked after. So it really hurts me that these things are showing up.
Thank you. I missed Lori there. Are you there? Yes, no? Shauna.
So yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation, and it just made me think so much about just the importance of learning about history of things that you kind of have an idea of things that have happened, but just to do a little deep dive once in a while to get updated on things that have gone on in Canada and not forget about those things, and just, you know, keep that in the present a little bit in these kind of conversations. I think it's really, really beneficial, because a lot of that stuff was pretty surprising, and I'm thinking, geez, I need to go to the library and get some books out and stuff. But I'll be putting the resources from today on the McDougall website, so that will help get the word out. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's Ronnie, but I think it's Louise there. if they're there. No, we'll move on to Trudy for our final.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Trudy, and Tony's my cousin. So I face racism every day when I go shopping. So I experienced twice at Safeway this week. So that's all I have to say. I just face racism almost every day. Thank you.
Oh, Trudy, I'm sorry for that. I feel that.
It's interesting. We had a person who's involved with the community beside us in Cochrane. She goes to the Hillhurst Church, and things that she's brought up in other contexts are about the harm of the racist attitudes in that place. And so it's coming from the Morley community. We know how historic that is. We know how long-lived that racist edge has been. And so it's always difficult in those situations where when we confront it, we look at it as though things haven't changed and that this is more of the same. And
Tony?
So, yeah.
When we were in Sri Lanka, we would walk with people who were being marginalized, and we walked with them in safety. They were often likely, as advocates for social change, could have been targeted. But I wonder about how we could implement something like that. I would go shopping with Trudy. We could shop together, even if we had to stay 6 feet apart. We could do it because sometimes what we need is a friend and ally. Just be there to just push the cart and be together. I would do that, Trudy.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. I thank you all for the insight and the comments and your participation here. And thanks especially to Pamela, Heather, and Martha for that presentation. And that we will continue to work towards this. And we didn't mention at the beginning, but I think it's good to close with the idea that we are living in a time of Asian Heritage Month, and we are living in a time when that effort to make that visible, to make that honorable, to make that a commitment to people of Asian heritage, to be part of our community, to kind of open that up, was intended to be a good thing. And now we kind of shirk that when the going gets tough and we have a situation where this pandemic has kind of brought out the worst in all people. And so we want to temper that with reminding ourselves what we believe, who we are. It is that process of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went through in South Africa, where they took part in that recovery of memory, the recovery of narrative, the recovery of place and of space, in order to re-understand their place in the world and how they are living as a result of the conditions around them, and how they can reset that in a way that is more positive and influential for those next generations, to kind of give them a grounding and a foundation that gives back to the people what they believe and who they are, and it gives a dignity to those groups. And so when we come back to this point of Asian Heritage Month, it is in essence to recognize those fundamental rights as were established by the treaties, that we would live in and amongst each other in a peaceful way, that we would share resources, that we would share our understandings and our teachings in order that we might become a better people because of it, a collective people. And as we work towards that, to change what is and how we see the world and its wrongs, we can do more. We can do more to promote and to understand and to come together with our teachings and respect one another in a way that is life-giving and is good for our communities and for the generations to come. So in all of this, very thankful to have the groups here. We'll be coming back again next week to talk about the LGBTQ conversion therapy ban and how important that has been to really catalyzing the momentum of a group and their interest and their focus and how that can become something of a measure. And I think that it is something that is showing us a way for the racialized groups and the anti-racist work. We're seeing some of that play out in what's going on for the LGBTQ community and how they have to mobilize in order to protect their own sense of being and sense of self within that realm of being continuously targeted and ostracized and excluded. And so there's potential there for really learning what we're doing. And I think one of the comments that Munja said was that that we can look forward to continuing this conversation, and that if we do a next session, that will be kind of a focus there to take some of these tools and to actually put them into place, put them into action. And so to close off, I always like to say a prayer for each of us and to wish everyone a good night and safety in this time of struggle, in this time of disease, and safety for all your loved ones and safety for all your people in your communities and in your various congregations. So I'll say our stony prayer. Om Chagezi, Twawan Chezi, Jesus Christ, Wanchapar Chezi, the Chagawaka, Wagahu, Jakezi, Warichin, Zinde, Narigi Chabichin, Nagahais, Nagu Chatnea Ichiat. Amen. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks to
Bye-bye.
everyone. Have a safe, wonderful night.